Hello and welcome back. My name is John Dotson, and today's video essay is titled To Be Forgotten: How J.R.R. Tolkien Creates Pacifist Aesthetics in The Hobbit's Return Home. This is your spoiler warning. It is highly recommended you read the Lord of the Rings novel before beginning, as that is what we are primarily dealing with, and I will be discussing the second to last chapter, so of course there will be plenty of spoilers. And with that, let us begin. While Tolkien focuses on war and the effects of war throughout Lord of the Rings, the largest threat to the main characters in regard to their initial goal doesn't come until after Sauron is defeated. In the Scouring of the Shire, Tolkien uses pacifist aesthetics in order to show that the largest threat to soldiers isn't necessarily the enemy weapons, but instead the return home, the return to that idealized land they've been fighting for. Only to notice that not only has it irrevocably changed, but it's changed against the soldiers who in their minds just saved their world. Tolkien manages this in a broad sense by having the Shire literally turned against the Hobbits, but also in a more subtle sense of having the Shire and Bree ignore and refuse to see the feats that the Hobbits have done. This is a reflection of Tolkien's own experience, and the reflection throughout history shows how war's effects on the soldiers that fight in it carry far beyond the battlefield itself. The primary theoretical framework I am drawing on for this essay is Dr. Casey Andrews' Writing Against War, in which he details out what he calls pacifist aesthetics in interwar British literature. He describes multiple formal and stylistic techniques used in order to merge literature and anti-war protest. Notable forms of anti-war writing were disenchantment of violence, writing around war, or formally ignoring war in order to draw an audience engagement. Tolkien seems to use another way, physical manifestation of potential analogy. It is known that Tolkien's own experiences in World War I influenced and made it into Lord of the Rings in some form. S. Brett Carter discusses it in his essay dealing with heroes in the New Age of Heroes. We see Tolkien drawing on his experience when describing war or how to properly do war best. We also see Tolkien draw on his experiences with the effects of war in Middle-earth mirroring real life, such as a wound dealt by a Morgul blade lasting forever, similar to how the psychological effects of what Tolkien would have called shell shock and what we would call today PTSD also lasts forever. This physical manifestation is not contained to characters or small lore details, however, but it in fact totally disrupts the following action following the conclusion. As the Hobbits return home from defeating Sauron, we see multiple areas of the world after the destruction of the ring. A notable similarity among them all is that they are healing in some form. A great pall has been lifted wherever the Hobbits stop as they bring restoration to the lands of Middle-earth. A notable exception, though, would be Bree. When the Hobbits arrive at Bree, the gate is closed and locked. The Hobbits are held back until the gatekeeper, who is noted to be armed and fearful, notices Gandalf and allows the Hobbits in. Even then, there's a sense of fear throughout Bree, with Mr. Butterbur even answering the door armed. The Hobbits left Bree, a peaceful and idyllic town, but now it's become outwardly hostile and hard for them to enter. It is still recognizable physically, but it's also so foreign to the Hobbits. They even notice that Mr. Butterbur hasn't changed, but they also note that his physical appearances have become extremely different. It's a weird double meaning. These similarities at first glance that are totally different when interrogated would have also been the experience of many soldiers returning from war. Soldiers like Tolkien would have returned to a country that still physically remains the same, but had a very different spirit. This experience is reflected across all wars, with all soldiers. In the Vietnam War in America, many soldiers reported coming back to the United States and returning to a country that was the same country, but totally unrecognizable. This is detailed out in Ken Burns' Vietnam War documentary. He interviews many American soldiers, and all of the soldiers discuss the difficulty of that return home to a land that they don't recognize and doesn't recognize them. It's a land that refuses to acknowledge their sacrifice or their feats. This refusal to acknowledge the soldiers' feats is also reflected in Tolkien's display of the return home for the hobbits. Mr. Butterbur calls the hobbits' adventure less important affairs. And at the gate to the Shire, none of the hobbits actually recognize Pippin, Merry, Sam, or Frodo. They don't even recognize that the group of four went on an adventure, assuming that they had been killed in the old forest. This lack of recognition of the hobbits' experience also results in an underestimation of the hobbits' ability. It's represented in the attempt of the sheriffs to arrest the hobbits, an attempt that goes horribly wrong. This underestimation is also a reflection of what many soldiers experienced. Not only were soldiers ignored, but they were expected to return to content and domestic lives. Their capabilities were shunned. The fact that they were now trained and experienced killers were set aside. And they too were also expected to forget. We see the name of the generation emerge from this for those who took part in World War I, the Forgotten Generation. The returning soldiers of the Vietnam War discuss this as well. In the very first episode of the documentary, there are multiple interviewees saying over and over that the war was not talked about. The soldiers don't discuss the war. The families don't discuss the war. America itself didn't discuss the war. There was no addressing PTSD. There was no restoration for those who now have to deal with combat instincts drilled into them, who have to wake up at night with nightmares because of their traumatized past. The hobbits also display this feeling, not only in actions through the dismissal of the sheriffs, but also in their very attitude. When the hobbits return, their immediate intention is to confront the chief. They threaten violence when they're challenged at the gates. Yeah, they aren't pushovers anymore. They're very capable and experienced soldiers, but that also means they resolve the problems in the ways that they resolved them during war, namely violence. These elements form Tolkien's anti-war message. Tolkien uses the hobbits' return home to physically manifest what he experienced, what the soldiers of Vietnam experienced, and what all soldiers experienced and continue to experience. The physical rendition of a homeland that was idealized and fought for, one turned hostile and foundationally changed, so much that it disrupts the hobbits' return home and hijacks the narrative, is born in Tolkien's memory. It is reflected in the experiences of those returning from Vietnam. It is a pacifist message. It is through artful rendition, Tolkien causes the audience to consider the hobbits' treatment by their neighbors and friends, to consider how deeply the war changed not only the hobbits, but their homeland as well, and how maliciously that homeland turned against the hobbits. With those considerations, then come the larger considerations of soldiers in general, how war affects them, how war affects the homeland. These negative effects become clearly painted. The hobbits are so obviously distressed upon returning to their homeland, returning to a shire that is no longer theirs. And these reflections are damning of those who would conduct wars. The hobbits are no longer physically in danger, but all that they fought for, their very spirit, their drive, that is not only threatened, but it's almost destroyed. The culture is broken and the houses are torn down. That's the greatest threat to the hobbits. It's the greatest threat to all soldiers. The greatest risk, the hardest consequence, is that the land they fought, sacrificed, and died for would turn against them, or forget them, or simply dismiss them. It is the common experience, the constant experience. That is the anti-war message. Condemnation through rendition. Disenchantment of war by making the consequences real for the hobbits and for the readers. Consequences that are already real for tons of soldiers returning home, including Tolkien himself.